Thank you so much, Minister. That was also very stirring, and as you can tell, very complimentary presentations that we just heard and remarks. And I just want to make a couple of comments before I ask some questions and open it up. What I see here as common threads is that there's an appreciation that technology is a public good, and that technology companies play a vital role in delivering and providing that public good. But this is something that we in the policy community and the economic community don't actually appreciate well enough because we don't calculate it enough. There's very vague research and loose calculations, but they amount to the hundreds of billions of dollars of annual cost savings to businesses, to consumers, from the lower and lower cost of access to technologies that empower people to be entrepreneurial. And that's in the societies that have high technology penetration in the US and Europe, for example. So, $250 billion a year of cost savings to ordinary people. That data point doesn't get out there enough. And so we have in many societies, particularly in the West, some hostility, right, about whether or not technology companies are monopolistic players, is this the new finance, and so forth. If we had better data around the extent to which technology really is a public good and the role, the dissemination of that technology by leading companies such as Microsoft, I think we would have a different conversation. Second point is that Singapore is a place where we seem to have transcended what is clearly a very artificial divide, actually, between society and the technology sector through things like Smart Nation program. As the minister mentioned, Singapore, makes itself a test bed. It is very much a living lab. And I, for one, if anyone from Autonomy is here, I'm waiting for my driverless car ride. So let's, as technologies like that.
We probably won't give you the license to the approval to do it until we're ready.
Oh, they're lucky there's no steering wheel, I guess. But so importantly, though, with that's one example. But the Wi-Fi hotspots, the broadband, the sort of access centers that you mentioned, all of those things should help us to unlock the human potential. And as both of you have said, that's really what this is all about. How can we make sure that we're empowering people to stay ahead of the curve, or if not ahead of the curve, at least to manage the shifting roles that they will play in labor markets as a result of the radical advance of these technologies. And that fundamentally is what a smart city is about, not just the presence of technology, but the extent to which it's helping the people and how many people. So the third point I wanted to make is about this socio-economic transformation, which is indeed very disruptive. Even a country like Singapore that specializes in scenarios and forecasting has been caught off guard, like much of the world, with a simultaneous decline or adjustments in major sectors like oil and gas and finance simultaneously. And those are two critical sectors for the Singaporean economy. So how do we use technology to, as those sectors are maybe reinvented, revitalized? You mentioned fintech, for example. So out with the old finance, in with the fintech, but whom? Who's going to do it, right? Do we have the skill sets in place? And attracting the new kinds of investment from new kinds of companies that are going to help to train workers. So there is a lot of common ground in the remarks that you've both made. You both want to see technology help us do what we do better. And so with that, I just want to ask one question of each of you, and then I want to turn it immediately to the audience so that we have time for a good dialogue here. Tony, let me start with you. Because of the report you just mentioned that's being just sort of deployed, this as well as the discussions underway in Europe as well right now. Your intrepid head of Asia Pacific policy analysis, another faculty member here, Astrid, sent me a link today to an announcement that's been made in Europe about increasing cloud investment across the European Union. And it strikes me that the EU-US discussion, dialogue, tension is an example of safe harbor, shield, and so forth. Microsoft, as a truly global technology company, almost has a responsibility to try and anticipate these tensions. You're technologically ahead of where either country's regulations really are. So you have to try and help get them together because it ultimately undermines your business. So what I wanted to ask you actually is, to what extent, because of the cultural distance that exists transatlantically over issues like data privacy, in a way, you're hedging. I mean, you're trying to provide the solutions that satisfy these different markets. So can you talk to us a bit about the global regulatory landscape, and which is in a way a values landscape, and a bit deeper on how you are helping these different jurisdictions come to terms with the potential of technology to overcome some of these barriers?
You know, I would say that's pretty much the rationale for what went into the launch today of this particular book, but broader, the principled approach that we would argue that we're trying to take as a company. When you start talking about this issue of serving multiple countries in a digital transformation discussion that transcends borders but brings up this national sovereignty around data conversation, where Microsoft is trying to drive is to trying to drive the rule of law as our basis, and also evolve the rule of law to address these issues that, quite frankly, don't exist and are not codified in laws in many of the countries, and even the two areas you mentioned, the US and the EU. You know, we've done quite a bit on standards, cloud standards, third-party or external attestation of cloud and cloud capability, compliance, looking at leveling of compliance by the type of data, a public-facing website versus mission-critical versus personal information, trying to put a taxonomy and a governance around what kind of data is most at risk, and aligning, if you will, the risk mitigation to, if you will, the data classification. We've taken a pretty strong stand as a company about the privacy issue of data, that the data belongs to the customer. We've gone to court with our own, quite frankly, as a US company, with our own federal government on this issue. And we've stood with other technology companies that have gone to court on these issues. But there are some maybe international crises or emergencies that may require us to at least rethink from time to time. And those should be not the rule, but, if you will, the exception. I think the conversation here is around law, policy, and the advancement of technology. And right now we have one running ahead with all of the examples, the tangible examples here in Singapore, but many more I could offer around the globe. They all introduce a trade-off. And for the economists in the room, you know, there's no simple scatter plot and regression that you can run on some of these. You actually have to look at some weighing. And so they all require governance. And where Microsoft is moving, and is, whether it's in a book or in its approach, is trying to change the dialogue, or at least, first of all, introduce the dialogue to be one that says, how do we, across the globe, ensure that the rule of law addresses issues of security, compliance, transparency, and privacy? Even when there are rules within the country, what are the standards and the baseline that we're going to go to for cross-data border flow? How do we ensure that policy is written to the rule of law? Because there are some places where there's law and no policy, and policy without law. So we have to catch up there. And then, quite frankly, what is the governance when we reach an impasse? When there is a question of global security, when there is a challenge to data center management, when there's an issue that's facing the globe, what then is the governance to address that? So I think this comes down to, I would say, the less sexy things, the things that people don't, look, it's fun to play with a device, it's great to, look, I go by the screen, we all start enjoying our technology. It's much less fun to sit in a room and work through these very, very real, detailed policy issues, to look at laws that don't exist and laws that should exist to address this. This is where we've got to bring this conversation, not just nationally, but quite frankly, multinationally and globally. So that's really where we're going.
It's a great point. The international maturity is lacking because the conversation across governments, because of their sovereignty concerns, hasn't reached the level of maturity that global companies actually intrinsically
But I think it's
have.
even complex within your own country
Yeah,
to start
absolutely.
off with. So even with that, it's difficult enough. And then you bring in international politics and power play. That changes the whole sort of dimension.
It's
altogether.
very
really
geopolitical,
difficult.
as we've seen with the disputes going on. Minister, you gave so many wonderful examples of citizen empowerment through technology that are going on here in Singapore. I wanted to zoom in a bit on the issue of entrepreneurship. You know, I mentioned a bit about what's happening in the labor market and the economy here in Singapore, and clearly there is now, in post-industrial societies more broadly, there's a real requirement that the services sector ramp up, which is to say also the peer-to-peer economy, if you will. People finding ways to transact, engage in commerce with each other, form startups, looking at non-tradable services areas where citizens are really just in an organic way. And you mentioned Block 71 and places where startups are starting to emerge. But what is your vision for having more of the Singaporean population and the next generation work in this horizontal fashion rather than in the vertical fashion that so many people in the pioneer generation and the current generation are accustomed to, where they're working for GLCs or multinationals? That is around across the Western world, across OECD economies, across developing countries, that is shifting and being replaced by a world which is people call the gigonomy, a freelancer world. And no doubt for the next generation of Singaporeans that too will apply. So how about this shift towards a horizontal peer-to-peer economy?
Well, I think in my previous capacity as Minister for Manpower, one of the things we find is that increasingly young people are not taking on jobs in the formal sense. I think a lot of them are looking for contract, short-term. I think they like the idea of flexibility, they like the idea of mobility, to try different things. Although that has some impact, I think, in terms of stability, but I think as you begin to get used to operating and working on that basis, I think that would actually perhaps facilitate the transition to the next stage. But I think it's difficult because I think in Singapore you have a fairly stable economy. I mean, the structures are there, the companies are doing fairly well, wages are moving in real terms, slowly, but it is moving. Unemployment is pretty decent. So there's a lot to give up to take those risks and to embark on something that's quite different. So I think for us particularly, that change is going to be not easy. You see some of the trends emerging, but I'm not sure whether that in itself naturally would lead to that form of economy, because I think it could well be just more a lifestyle or interesting. I don't know whether that's going to transit that way. But I think the inertia to move away from this more vertical kind of a structure, I think is quite real. So I think so rather than look at it from a whole economy standpoint, how do you then, to me, it's always about breaking it down into bite-sized chunks, things that you can do, right? So perhaps what you do is you look at slices where you can begin to initiate some of these ideas. So some of the startups, I mean, the scene has been growing quite attractively in the last couple of years. And I think, I don't know whether we envisage it to be quite so successful, but we see more young people trying. And in many ways, the flip side of it, I look at it, is that if you have a stable base, which means that, look, you try, you fail, you come back to the normal stuff and do the vertical stuff, but you have a good alternative there, see? So you could actually perhaps experiment and try, as opposed to perhaps when you don't have those kind of safety nets. So I think what we're trying to do really is to seed some of these startup spaces through some of the courses, to perhaps in fairly boutique areas, allow more young people to try. And hopefully to also demonstrate that this is actually quite viable. But the flip side is that you also need the economy to begin to evolve that way as well. And that's something that I think the market has to begin to respond. But I think we need to transit to that kind of economy, because otherwise, I think if you remain the traditional vertical slice ones, I think you will find a challenge to navigate that space. So I think it's really about individuals, but at the same time, I think also trying to encourage startups that can operate in quite a different way.
Minister, I just wanted to highlight on that, it would be remiss in a school of public policy for me not to comment on the new competency model that we're looking for, and not just in companies like Microsoft, but we talk about this sort of new horizontal capability. A lot of that shows itself in data science and those types of framing capabilities, to frame and to respond in digital ways quickly. It's probably the #1 competency we're looking for and building, as we have a curriculum that we're sharing not only here but around the world. this new generation, and even those who have had traditional vertical jobs that are looking to reskill, the ability to frame and understand the outputs of this massive machine learning and algorithms and capability, the technology is a means to an end. We still have to be able to frame the right questions and answer the right questions and have that in context. And it's actually taking us back to a Renaissance learning approach, which was much more interdisciplinary. And public policy is just an area that tends to combine multiple disciplines.
And you need to start early because it's a practice.
Very early, very
From
early.
young, how do you manage uncertainties? How do you manage with data points that straddles across different subject matters and be comfortable with that? And it comes with practice. So you almost need an entire education system to relook at how you teach, how you learn. And that's something we're looking at, but it's quite scary to change because, I mean, we have a pretty decent education system, but then when you shift, is it evidence-based? Are you informed? Is it going to achieve the kind of outcomes you want? And that's where we are.
And there's a scary part in the middle.
And that's the scary part.
When you don't know exactly.
Exactly.
And teachers have to be retrained as well.
Policy schools are really now just in the early phases of trying to develop a curriculum around what is a data bureaucrat, right? And it's framing issues as well as understanding the analytics of that data, and that's something that is in the very, very early stages. I think the Lee Kuan Yew School probably is going to begin to start larger investments in that area. Now, let's take questions from this packed house. I could ask questions all day. For example, I do want to know if Microsoft is going to buy Twitter, but I'm not going to actually ask that. I'm just going to say that I would like to know.
And I won't actually answer that. So that works well. That works well. We're already working well together.
Let's take the gentleman in the back.
Good evening. Thank you for the very exciting sharing about the possibilities and the challenges. In terms of priorities and threats, what do you perceive to be the two biggest internal and external threats to the cloud for global good? And how would you respond to the two biggest internal and external threats? That's number one. Number two, I was very excited just now when you talk about how technology can be used to help refugee children. Because later this month, I'll be going down to Myanmar to work with trainee teachers. So I would like to hear from Microsoft perspective, what initiatives or what tools or resources do you have that can be really empowering to help bridge the education gap? So for me, it's bringing, in addition to the pedagogy, it's bringing in the mobile phone, palm-size projector, and internet, and helping to share the trainee teachers about the resources. And I'll be happy to hear from Microsoft what are your recommended approaches.
Okay. There's about 5 questions there, but that's okay.
Right.
I'm gonna try to take a couple of them. One, when you talk about threats to sort of cloud for good, I think I hear internal and external. I'm not sure what we're defining as internal and external. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have, or two of the biggest challenges that we have, is this issue of the rule of law not being where it needs to be. This willingness, and we know underpinning law and policy is generally politics and geopolitical, and at a global stage, global politics. But we have to get an informed political population that knows how to address these issues in the rule and codified in rule of law. I think we can only go so far. We've now seen technology outstrip. We have to close the gap to rule of law. And quite frankly, to policy. I think that's one, and that's part of why we went down this path. The second is going to sound like a very soft issue, but I think it underpins so much. This issue of trust is huge. People will not use technology if they don't trust it. So we have a trust issue, but we also see a trust issue going in public service, where citizens are losing trust in their government. So for two issues, governments and technology have to come together on this issue of trust. Governments not trusting technology, citizens not trusting government, citizens having more technology from a consumer perspective and expecting that experience to be in their government when we don't have trust underpinning all of it. So it's amazing how much time we spend at Microsoft building trust assets. I call them trust assets, the assets that help our customers, whether they be consumer customers or big enterprises, government, citizens, understand how to redefine trust. How do you trust this technology? If I show you the source code, will that give you trust? If I show you how to adopt it, if I give you benchmarks and a third party tells you it's trustworthy, will that give you trust? If I show you down to the detail exactly how it was designed, does that give you trust? What is it that generates trust? And that's a huge issue underpinning how much we can get out of the cloud and, quite frankly, the technologies that currently exist. Let me go quickly to your question about refugee real quick, because it's pretty passionate, very current right now. The commitment that we made at the UN was particularly specific for the US request, but fundamentally what we're doing is, in the first time that we've really put together all of the assets of Microsoft to address the refugee experience. I sat with over 160 refugee women in New York, and they told me three things. First, listen and stop telling us what the refugee experience is. Listen and let us co-design for that experience. Co-design what we need. Second, give us real skills. Don't teach me to sew, teach me how to code. Literally, told me directly. They want skills for a future, but not the second. And then the third conversation was help use the Microsoft brand and other brands to help change the narrative, because I feel isolated, discriminated, biased. Change the word and the meaning of the word refugee. And that's what I learned at the UN, that migratory patterns and globalization, they're here to stay. The refugee population, obviously we have to address uniquely, but migratory patterns are here to stay. So we've got to change this negative narrative of what it is. In fact, as a US citizen, it's somewhat ridiculous to talk about this in a country that was built off of people that came from somewhere else.
So, can I add
that was a challenge. Go ahead. No.
a perspective of the refugees. One of the things I realized when I was involved in the tsunami about 11 years ago, this is in Aceh, so quite backwards in some of the towns. And I remembered there were people coming in and talking about how they should rebuild this place. Oh, we should bring in, and I remember the architects and people looking at setting up computer systems. We should automate. Okay, maybe I'm not an expert in that field in the military, but trying to deal with the issues there. But you realize that the question is, building the things is easy. Even providing skills that we think is skills for the future, but you are living there. Is it sustainable? What is practical? So I think that's something to think about, I think, when working with refugees or people in a crisis situation, because if they are going to be uplifted and moving somewhere else, perhaps you can look at something that's different. But if they're going to remain in place, then we need to see in the steady state what's going to be real for them in terms of practical skills, things that they would have access to, and how would they thrive and have a better life within that context, while perhaps providing the opportunities for them to grow for the future. But usually you will be limited by resources, time, and all that, so you've got to decide what exactly you want to do. So there's a practical and an aspirational, but I think you need to contextualize it to where they are and where they're likely to be in the next 5-10 years.
And let me just add to that, just practically, the few things that we're doing. White space connectivity in a refugee camp is huge. So whether it's Malawi or Jordan, we are absolutely extending our efforts in TV white space to get connectivity in the camps. Particularly if you're going to be there, you've got to have access. You've got to have some form of connectivity. We know the average time of a refugee, average time is 21 years to be a refugee. So we have to do that. We do Skype Translator, which is just a technology allows, if you're going to be in a different country, how do you get the translation to the other language? It's just an immediate way to adapt. Digital literacy is one, but also psychosocial is the new approach to training. These are people who have come through a very tough situation. We're finding that just basic education and digital literacy is not enough. We have to put it in the context of psychosocial. For traumatized individuals. So all of this are the kinds of technologies that we're doing, and then just making commitments to take education and training as far as we can. Right now we just committed to another 20,000 refugees over the next year.
In the interest of time, I'm going to have to ask that our final three questioners just very briefly, 15 seconds each, ask your questions, and then we're going to have one round to respond to all of your questions. Please.
Hi, my name is Vimaljit, and I was a regulatory lawyer, just came back from Washington, D.C., in fact. So I'm very optimistic about the impact that technology has. And I'm sorry, this may go on past 15 seconds, but very quickly, when we are looking at the world's problems today, I see climate change as a world problem as well. And what I read recently is that just the data centers itself is a source of 2% of the global emissions, which parallels and it's equal to the emissions of aircrafts. So in this, looking at technology as a vital resource for solving the world's problems, do we have solutions to the problem that technology is contributing to?
Excellent question. Next.
Good evening. My name is Eric Hagen. I'm a student here at the Masters of Public Policy program. Both of you talked about the socio-economic consequences of this technological transformation and revolution. My question is, do you think the current society structures are able to deal with these consequences, or will we see big developments here as well? The example I have in mind is a universal basic income, which is being discussed many places around the world. It's not something I personally have been convinced of, but it expands the sort of mental landscape of what we might imagine.
Good
Thank you.
And the lady behind?
Okay, my name is Surya. I'm a student, Masters in Public Policy in this school. So I'd just like to address there is a need to address the technological awareness divide. In a simple example that my team, a group of students, public policy students, created a If It Were Me online poverty simulation, just to create awareness at first. And then from there, we got feedback that our data was useful for social studies, and that we were able to connect computer science with urban poverty in Singapore, and also a charity called Daughters of Tomorrow. And I see the biggest challenges is that those in governments do not know the potential of technology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Let's use our closing remarks. Let's use our closing remarks to address these issues about the ecological sustainability of the IT industry, social adjustments such as universal basic income, and awareness about the sector. Maybe should we go in reverse order, if we may? Brief statements to wrap up, Minister.
Well,
or any subset you like of questions.
No, well, social issues, I think even in Singapore, there are real social issues. We deal with it every day. As a member of parliament, I see it on a real basis every week. How you apply technology, really, there are different ways of doing it. I mean, I'm not sure what's the context of your study. I'd be quite happy to look at your data point and what leads you to the conclusion that we are not really aware of how to maximize the potential. But if you have new insights that we have not thought about, quite happy to take a look at that. But I think the key is, I think technology, as I mentioned earlier, there are many, many different ways to detect problems. The problem today is that things are happening, but are the information points or the data points entering a grid or a control platform where you actually track it? Because I think if you begin to correlate data in a much better way, I think you can begin to pick up information earlier, and I think you can actually intervene to prevent those exact problems before it happens. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we have to look at, but like I mentioned earlier, there is a dilemma. How probing do you want us to be? How intrusive do you want us to be? That's something that as a society we need to grapple with as well.
Mm-hmm. Tony, let's conclude with
I'll try to wrap. Yeah, I'll try to wrap up the three. So let me maybe working backwards. I do think that there's a curriculum that needs to be introduced. This is a great place to introduce it, around technology and policy and law coming together. We call it, whether it's civic tech. There is a need for government workers, and I say that as a former government workers to understand more about the adoption of technology and some of these trade-offs and the policy implications. I do think there's more to be done, and there's more training to be done there. And I think this is one that we have to kind of capture very quickly into the curriculum and into the training and into the actual work experience within government. Not that most government officials don't have a sense of a technology policy, but really understanding how far it can go. This conversation around will it change society, the societal impact, I'm very encouraged, actually. I probably take the contrarian position here. I am so encouraged, particularly when I look at health. I look at some core areas and I look at what can be done, and I'm looking at quick adoption of population health, the ability to track your own health. You gave some wonderful examples. The elderly, I look at even my parents, just out of their delight of being closer to my children and their grandchildren. They are all over technology in ways that at 81 and 82 I would have never anticipated, and is keeping them vital and their brains moving through this. It's just fantastic. I think we have an opportunity with the social systems because I see such quick adoption. And I think the more adoption you have of that kind of technology, you're going to address some of the social implications that are there. And to the individual who asked the question about data centers and the emissions of data centers and green, if you will, green sustainable, it's absolutely the focus. I know that Microsoft is all over, and we were first to make commitments to reduce those emissions in our data centers with green technology. Again, you should hold every technology company accountable for what are they doing to the planet as it relates to data centers, and they should be able to transparently describe to you exactly what that investment looks like and what the impact is. And we're very proud that we actually expose that, we share that very openly, and we are measured by third-party organizations routinely. So feel very good about that conversation, but we should all be held accountable there.
Well, this has been an extraordinary conversation, very wide-ranging and positive. Please, everyone, join me in thanking Minister Chuan-Jin, Tony Townes-Whitley. Thank you all so